while the people are filing into our virtual auditorium. I'm watching the numbers to see as they go up, and the time will come to start when they kind of stabilize as soon as everyone is in. Let's see. That looks fairly good, I guess. Welcome, everyone, to the Wilmette Institute's dialogue webinar on global challenges and opportunities. In this series, we highlight not just the threats and dangers that humanity faces, but also the potential solutions. We are examining in this series such challenges as the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, dysfunction at the international level, racism, hate speech, gender inequality, and the extremes of wealth and poverty. In short, most of the kinds of issues that were raised in the 1986 statement called the Promise of World Peace. The goal always is to focus on opportunities to solve and mitigate the challenges and not just dwell on the problems instead. Tonight, we will be able to focus on one of those issues that I listed, hate speech. The topic is called Destroying a Thought of Hatred. And the basic idea here is to explore how societies around the world grapple with polarization around identities and the rise of hate speech. What tools are in the Baha'i scriptures that can be applied to that broader context? The talk explores some examples of efforts in building social cohesion and countering hate. Our speaker is Vasu Mohan, who has had over 20 years of experience in democracy, governance, and human rights programming in Asia, with a focus on political, social, and legal empowerment of the disenfranchised, youth, women, ethnic minorities, and persons with disabilities. He leads Asia programs at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, the IFES, where he has been since 2001. He has supervised programs in field offices in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Solomon Islands, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Timor-Leste. Quite an impressive list of places where he has often gone to, for example, oversee elections and see how these systems have been coping with issues of democracy. So this dialogue series is broadcast live also over our Facebook and YouTube channels, and it'll also be recorded. So if you are unable to see the whole thing tonight, you'll be able to watch it all later on our Facebook channel. We're designing these to reach a general audience whenever possible, so invite your friends and colleagues to join in as well. So without further delay, I would like to turn to Vasu Mohan. Welcome, Vasu, to Global Challenges and Opportunities, and we look forward to hearing your presentation tonight.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. I want to begin our time together today by remembering all those who sacrificed their lives to bring us to this point. Our nations and the world itself seems to be forced by this pandemic to face our own inadequacies, the gross injustices, and the questions and assumptions on which we've built our societies. I want to pay homage to our Black, Brown, and Native brothers and sisters who, despite genocide, slavery, detention, systemic injustices, and the endless daily microaggressions, continue to demand only for equality and never for revenge, as one sister said recently. And in the midst of their pain, they have built up and nurtured communities, and these communities that better mirror divine compassion, mercy, empathy, kindness. My own spiritual journey is very much built on that compassion and kindness and continues to this date. And for that, I'm most grateful. Today, I want to invite you all to come with me on a journey. They talked about my professional experiences, and this is a unique combination of where my spiritual life and my professional life have intersected, and I want to take you on this journey with me. It begins with this radical idea, destroying a thought of hatred with a more powerful thought of love. For many of you who are tuning in, you'll be very familiar with this statement of Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. I want us to first look at the broader context of this quote from Paradox. There is nothing so heartbreaking and terrible as an outburst of human savagery. I charge you all that each one of you concentrate the thoughts of your heart on love and unity. Concentrate all the thoughts of your heart on love and unity. When a thought of war comes, oppose it by a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hatred must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. Thoughts of war bring destruction to all harmony, well-being, restfulness, and content. Thoughts of love are constructive of brotherhood, peace, friendship, and happiness. This is the broader quote from which that particular piece is extracted. And within that, I really want to focus on a thought of hatred being destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. And this journey that I want to invite you on is sort of my own exploration of what is this more powerful thought of love? When we bring societies together, when we bring people together who want to create a society free of hate, and they want to destroy this hate, and they're searching for this more powerful thought of love, what is it? So this is the question that hopefully we'll be able to explore together during this time period. I have had the blessing and the privilege of working in many countries. This particular countering hate speech work, I'm drawing on experiences in Kenya, Libya, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And clearly the work that we do right here in the United States as part of the Baha'i community very much is part of this global conversation and effort to address hate speech. So you'll see the connections as we go along in the conversation. First, there are many definitions of hate speech. I want to focus on the United Nations definition. The most recent is from the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech. And this is the definition that I want to use, acknowledging that there are country-specific differences and there are sort of different emphasis. But broadly, any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group of people based on who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, ability or disability, or other identity factors. So this is what is hate speech. And while this says speech, writing, or behavior, images are certainly part of this definition. So this is there is a growing consensus on what is hate speech. Not every category is named here, but this is, or other identity factor covers this. While we're also talking about hate speech, I also want to talk about a few other concepts that are related. We are all very familiar with the terms hate, sort of fake news, or, we call it hoax in some countries. So this is a useful typology: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is when unintentionally mistakes are made when information is provided. Could be a range of types of mistakes, but it's wrong information, but there was no intention or no agenda behind it. Disinformation, on the other hand, is also wrong information, but there was some intent to manipulate or harm behind that. And malinformation is actually real information, such as information about a person's religion or a person's age or some particular incident that happened in their life that is taken and weaponized in a very specific interest or with a very specific agenda, and not in the broadest public interest. So misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, this is a framework that will also address later on in this work. And very often countering disinformation and hate speech activities happen together, knowing that they are different, but there are also a lot of similarities, particularly in terms of how we see them being disseminated. So the sort of broader range of issues here. I won't go into great detail, but just, raise some issues for our consideration. One is hate speech versus free speech. So this is the classic argument that says, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, this is a fundamental right. So people should be able to see or say whatever they want to. And if someone disagrees with that, they will then, provide a counter argument, and, the public will decide which of these, is right. So it's a very idealized setting that, the solution to hate speech is more free speech, not less free speech. So this is one argument. Now, it doesn't fully hold, because very often hate speech is not only organic, it can be amplified, it can be used as a political tool. I work in elections, so I see disinformation and hate speech, very often used towards political ends. So, there's an amplification factor that just free speech cannot automatically drown out. So this is one set of challenges. Now, there is some truth to this, that sometimes when we look at legal responses, laws are made, and sometimes these laws could be, there's an over-implementation that could happen, and it could border censorship. And some cases, in some countries, these laws could be used selectively to go after a particular minority group or a particular political candidate, or could also go after political enemies of those who are in power. So there is that possibility of laws, hate speech laws, being selectively used. Now, social media platforms, now I have to remind, in a lot of contexts, when we talk about this, hate speech predates social media. It even predates, TV or any electronic media. There have been entire programs that have been conducted by word of mouth, and not necessarily with any electronic media. There have been, the Rwanda genocide was primarily radio, and now we've seen sort of what television and other social media platforms can do. But there is something that is really unique in that the ability to amplify social, ideas through social media. And particularly because attention economy, social media does not differentiate between engagement that is positive or engagement that is negative. It just looks at engagement, and this algorithmic opacity, you do not know what is happening behind and how certain things get prioritized. It's all towards primarily profit out of attention. So social media platforms have created an additional, or a huge challenge in this space. There are different definitions to hate speech based on what country you're in and what approaches. And there's also a continuum of what is humor, what is satire, what is offensive. It's often clearly you can tell the difference, but there is that, difficulty. And then there's also this clear idea of whether something falls into a, legal definition of hate speech or not. It could be dangerous speech, and there's definitions that are coming up around that, and there's an incitement to violence. So these are sort of a range of issues that are being addressed. And in one of the more recent letters that we saw from the Baha'i World Center, there's this idea of what is happening to, in many nations, we saw progressive building of groups of nations sort of culminating with the European Union as a great experiment. And now we are seeing tribalism and nationalism sort of creep back in and gain more momentum, as globalization, which is supposed to bring a lot of good to the world, has also brought with it a lot of challenges. So people are retreating into these, spaces and are defining themselves by very narrow identities. So I want to take us then with a little bit of context to laws. Sort of what are the laws saying? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the basis of international law. It begins with all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So because you're a human being, you have these rights. It's not one, it's a range of fundamental human rights. So we already have that. And, there's equal protection of all against discrimination, and the right to safety of person. So these are really important rights to think about. And often these rights are mirrored in national constitutions to varying degrees. One of the key issues is there is also a right to obviously participate in government, Article 21, Article 20, the right to assemble and associate, and then there is the right to freedom of expression. If your right of freedom of expression to say whatever you want starts infringing on my right to safety of person, then we need to have a conversation. And very often this free speech, hate speech conversation, comes under that. Or if your right to free speech starts challenging my right to dignity and equality, then we need to have a conversation. The first time in 1965, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination actually makes it the responsibility of governments to address dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority, racial hatred, and racial discrimination and racial motivated violence. So it is the responsibility of states to actually do their part in addressing this. What we often see is a combination. States are doing, in many countries have laws. There are problems in their implementation. These laws are in place, but also sometimes the state themselves use hate speech as a tool to hold on to power or amplifying sort of societal differences. Also, another question that often comes up, which I'm always surprised by, but is also important, is discriminatory language against women. Is that hate speech? And clearly it is. We have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And even though so much of discriminatory language against women is normalized in so many cultures we work in, they are wrong. And that type of discriminatory speech is also hate speech. And it's important to say that, particularly in the context of women leaders and women in politics. Who's protected then? There's a range of people. So there are different UN conventions and treaties that protect different identity groups. So this is a range of identities that are protected. What we saw then during the coronavirus is a direct challenge to these marginalized communities. We saw people of Chinese, descent in East Asia, being attacked and being blamed for bringing coronavirus into their countries. We saw people of East Asian descent in the rest of the world. And these are some examples from India, where people of the northeastern part of India who are physically more resembling of East Asians being attacked for either being called coronavirus or being attacked for being vectors of coronavirus. We also saw poor people and marginalized communities, historically vulnerable communities, also disproportionately impacted, including here in the US. Due to systemic racism, we see Black, Brown, and indigenous communities disproportionately impacted by COVID. Ethnic religious minorities in many countries were blamed. And sometimes governments used this as a way to shore up their vote banks. So hate, takes a lot of forms, and it became even more evident during the COVID crisis. This is Southern Poverty Law Center that tracks 940 hate groups across the US. We know, and we are in this particular time, we know what, racism and hate does in the US, and what this COVID crisis has made us, face and address as a society. People who were, Black people, indigenous people, brown people, people who were facing racism always knew this, but clearly now there's a broader societal conversation around this. So what can be done? So this is the next part of the conversation. And in exploring this with my counterparts, civil society organizations, academics, governments, election commissions, often credible partners, working with them. So this is a framework that I have been, using. This comes, for those of you who are familiar with the core curriculum, you will know this framework of knowledge, wisdom, spiritual perception, and eloquent speech. This comes straight out of a verse from the writings of Baha'u'llah. So the first level is knowledge. To try to understand, create a common conversation about what is hate speech and why do people engage in it, who engages in it, and then what is the legal sort of framework around it? What does the law say about it? The second level of understanding is wisdom. How does hate speech impact individuals and societies? What are the very obvious types of challenges, and what are the more deeper challenges to society and social cohesion? The third level is spiritual perception. And this is, what do the great world religions say about hate and how to counter hate? And what qualities should counter speakers need? And the last is eloquent speech, which is eloquence in speech and action. Just as hate speech is not just speech, eloquent speech also in this context is eloquence in action. what does counter speech informed by this knowledge, wisdom, and spiritual perception look like? This is sort of what I have been, blessed to be able to explore through my work with a range of partners. And so what I'm sharing with you are some of those examples. So I want to share a few insights that we use to draw from, peace building traditions, spiritual traditions. First is this idea: peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. So this idea starting with justice. So peace should not be used to silence voices that are protesting against, oppression or injustice, but the presence of justice is really, what defines peace. So this is an idea from Dr. Martin Luther King and that philosophy. And then this is another one. This also comes from a Christian tradition. Peacemaking is not passive. It's the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring it. Particularly important because when you are engaging in counter speech, you do not want to take the characteristics of those who are engaging in hate speech. So, the language, the tone, the respect, the inclusion, how we express our counter speech has to be rooted in peacemaking traditions. This next idea is hate cannot drive out hate, only love can. This is, also evocative of Abdul Baha's statement. This next one is from a Persian tradition. It's a poem from Sadi that's been, translated, that sort of hints at the human body, analogy that we are different parts of the same body. And if you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. It's a beautiful poem of Sadi. And this then brings to the body politic analogy, clearly articulated and central to understanding oneness. There's sort of one analogy that we understand oneness through in great detail. It is the body politic, unity in diversity, not uniformity, and how there's cooperation and coordination. So these are all ideas that we discuss when we bring groups of people together. And people then will also, participants in our conversations will bring their own spiritual traditions, other ideas, indigenous ideas, sort of their own poetry, their culture, and looking for these, these concepts that frame counter speech. I often also talk about this idea of independent investigation of truth, which is an idea that Baha'is use in terms of spiritual journey. But also when we look at fake news, disinformation, misinformation, this independent, investigation of truth takes a whole nother level. By the aid of justice, which is seen here as a faculty, by the aid of justice, thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shall know through thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. So this is a really, we talk about justice both as a prerequisite, as sort of part of peace, but then also this faculty of fairness and of the ability to investigate and seek truth. So I want to, so this is the framework. We have the international legal framework, we have the national constitutions and national legal framework, and then what I, often called peace building and spiritual, framework. In most countries where we work, they're either Christian countries, Hindu, Muslim countries, or Buddhist countries, they have a strong spiritual tradition to draw on already. So these ideas generally resonate when we set the framework up for counter speech. So here are a few examples. A lot of the countering hate speech work that I do is in the context of elections. So, my examples will be drawn from there as well. This is counter speech in Kenya ahead of their last general elections. There were videos, there were messages, there was strong messaging bringing together diverse religious communities, civil society, government entities, and sort of setting this message that hate speech, is destructive to their society, and that they would hold people accountable who are engaging in hate speech. And one of these ideas that was used was, a house divided against itself cannot stand. These are clips from videos. If there's time later on, I'll share some. Also, using the voices of women leaders and traditional leaders was a very integral part of this countering hate speech campaign. And hate often translates to violence in a lot of people. And this women leaders quote, "As women, it is we who bury our children. Election should not be synonymous to violence." So these types of engagement have been, quite effective in reducing hate speech and violence, but also reducing the impact of make it less outcome determining so that people will not engage in it. And then this is a campaign against to counter discriminatory and violent speech against women in politics. Better Than This was a really powerful campaign that I saw play out in Kenya. So now I'll shift continents and take you to Indonesia. Later on in questions, you can probe me on any of these cases. Each one of this could be a very detailed presentation, and I'm running out of time. So I'll go to Indonesia, very, very diverse country. It's majority Muslim. It's the world's largest Muslim majority country, but it also has, large indigenous communities. Bali, the island that is just, Hindu majority, and there are Christian, communities. And Indonesia went through a very difficult gubernatorial election in the city of Jakarta, where religion was instrumentalized and was really weaponized. And they did not want to see that impact their entire national election. So the election commission, civil society, they brought in social media companies on the major social media platforms. They also brought religious leaders, and a coalition of people worked together to reduce the impact of disinformation and hate speech in Indonesia. And one of these exercises that I saw was in many local areas, not in the capital, but not only in the capital, but bringing together people of different religious communities, interfaith groups, and training them on how to de-escalate religious violence or religion-based hate speech if it occurred. So it's a really good initiative that I hope other countries will also can learn from and, and see how effective this is. These are bringing people from different faith communities. So on the one hand, they talk to people of their community, but on the other hand, as a collective, they also talk to society, at large. So it's a really good initiative. We also saw Mafindo. This is a wonderful organization started by young people who were doing fact checking and, countering disinformation and misinformation through fact checking. Now, fact checking alone may not solve a lot of these problems, but fact checking along with these other initiatives, definitely is a successful way to, or a proven way to address hate speech and disinformation. They often go together. Very often, hate speech is combined with disinformation about a particular community or a particular group of people. So these two go together, and fact checking plays an important, part. So, there are a couple of other pieces that I can talk about. I think I have, may have run out of time, but I'll come to some of these later. Sorry, I'm running, but I do want to close again with bringing our attention back to some of the concepts in the Baha'i writings, where the purpose of religion itself is to defined as promoting and safeguarding the interests of people and promoting the unity of the human race, and to foster a spirit of love and fellowship. That religion should not become a cause of hate. And in another place, it said that if that is what religion is doing to you, it's better to not have religion at all. So, I have had this opportunity to be part of, invited into homes, invited into organizations, and invited into societies and communities to be able to engage in this conversation about how to counter hate. And I've really learned a lot, and it's still a process where we are continuing to learn. I'm sure a lot of you who are listening to this have your own experiences and ideas. So I'll turn it back over to Rob and say we can have a discussion. I have a lot more that I can share, but maybe if questions come up, then I'll go back to those slides to discuss.
Excellent. Thank you, Vasu. I sort of hate to have you stop at that point because there was so many interesting comments you were making and so much interesting material you were covering. One question that occurs to me, and we'll see what questions pop up as we proceed, is that So in a way, there's different kinds of hate speech. There's the kind of hate speech that is going on neighbor to neighbor, where people are expressing prejudices, and you got to encourage neighbors to kind of counter it and such. But then there is professional hate speech, where people are spending millions or even tens of millions of dollars to lie about other people, or lie about a group, or lie about a campaign, or lie about candidates. That must be much more difficult to combat, it seems to me.
Definitely. I would almost add a third category to this. So, Nat Rothstein used to say prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. Right? And I always remember that it's an emotional commitment. It is not a fact-based commitment to ignorance, because by definition, facts will dispel. If we were open, facts will dispel our ignorance. So it's an emotional commitment to ignorance. So there is that individual prejudice which exists in a broader, social context. But, so if I go to the street and say something that is hateful, it may create hurt to another individual, but mostly I may end up looking, foolish at best. But if I'm in a society where that hate could trigger something, then I'm it's a very different. And if I belong to a certain community that has power and privilege, and and I'm directing it to a person who does not have that protection, then that puts them in greater harm, right? So there is that individual, prejudice that could be very harmful, but it's at that level. And one of the places where people are really struggling with is family members within their own families. It's a real struggle. And very often people will say, okay, this is all very good, but what do I do in my family WhatsApp group when people are really saying very, very bad things? And I don't know, how to respond. I don't want to cut off relations completely with this. So this is it's a real challenge. And it is something that, the ways we address broader hate speech, some of the strategies apply to this as well. But that's one thing. But the second thing is when hate speech is, it's almost like mercenary hate speech, where there's a lot of money, there's a lot of it. It may or may not be ideologically driven, but it works, so that's really tough to counter. And then sometimes you have, a combination of both, like structural racism that also, it's not really mercenary, it's actually structural. And that creates, hateful action, hate speech around that. So these are different, categories, and someone else might be able to break it down into different ways. What we do see is that a certain types, like for example, elections become a huge time in a time when hate speech is, very carefully, strategically used by people. A lot of money goes into it, and there are these bots that are creating, for engaging in inauthentic behavior, creating, hate, and that's very targeted and calculated. We have to address those very specifically. Social media platforms have a very strong role to play in it. But I also think where we have to look at hate speech not just to be what we are against, but what we are for. So when counter speech, to be able to articulate what we stand for, not just what we stand against. And in the context of race, I really think this statement of Black people being like people, the pupil of the eye that Baha'u'llah says, it's I call it the most great counter speech. It really, in one sort of statement, Baha'u'llah elevates, and there's a very good talk by Dr. Derek Smith, right? That I think it was at the Wilmette. It's one of the Wilmette Institute talks that I highly encourage people to listen to. And I've always thought of this, that taking that statement, it counters. It is very effective counter speech, but it counters in a very different way by stating a higher level principle about, and so at once it elevates, it sends a signal to people who have been recipients of hate speech, builds their nobility and, shines this light on them and, infuses them with spiritual power. It also sends a message to everyone else who's either wishy-washy or engaging in hate speech to say, this is the real nature. This is the real spiritual value of people of African descent. So I think, what does that look like in other contexts? I mean, this is, of course, counter speech that came from God, in a sense. And I feel like this is sort of where societies have to start thinking about how do you replace these discourses of division with a more powerful idea. So in the case of Kenya, the tribal divisions, they said one Kenya, one tribe. Kenya's my tribe was idea. In other countries, it could be we are all part of one clan, or we are part of one nation. It could be a national identity. And hopefully the identity is higher than even national identity, that it becomes a identity of humanity. And that is that more powerful thought of love, goes beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond nation, and goes to a higher thought.
One person has asked this very interesting question, and that's that under what circumstances do you have to enforce standards regarding hate speech, and who enforces the standards?
This is a very good question. And I think, in many countries and their constitutions, hate speech is not explicitly in their constitutions or laws. Now, some countries do have laws, and the European Union certainly has its own, the European Court for Human Rights actually does have a lot of legislation, rulings on hate speech. So depending on the country context, in fact, one of the first things that I engage with our civil society partners is to start mapping out who already has legal mandate and authority to address hate speech. So in the context of elections, are there provisions in the election law that say hate speech or discrimination should not be, or incitement to violence are illegal? Are there other human rights laws in the country? Is there a human rights commission? So where are all the places? So you look at the existing set of laws and legal framework and see where is either directly or through reference are hate speech addressed. And then those agencies should then be motivated and supported to enforce those, hate speech regulations. Now, there's also a sense of, where governments are not always acting in an impartial manner, they're acting in a very self-serving manner. Then, we have religious leaders, we have community leaders, and the civil society then functions as this voice of, a moral conscience of their society. They can, hold violators of hate speech laws accountable in the public sphere. So that is also a possibility. Then certainly, international courts and, ultimately Hague is one place where, hatred can be taken to. But the best place to start is to do an analysis within existing legal frameworks, who has that, authority, and in the long-term strategy, where should the advocacy be to have legal protections. A law is not sufficient. People's hearts and minds have to change, but the law is important. And where you have both, when you have both statutory responses and societal responses, that's when you have like light on light.
There was also, I believe I heard today, several companies were pulling their ads from Facebook because they were concerned that Facebook wasn't being sufficiently vigilant regarding hate speech on its platform. So you have that kind of what should you call it? Commercial pressure, I guess you could call it, that also gets used and just under some circumstances.
And in response to the Christchurch, bombings, there was a Christchurch call to action, and several social media companies came out and they committed themselves to several courses of action, but still it's not enough, and a lot more needs to be done, because fundamentally the platforms make profit through attention and engagement, and that does not distinguish good and bad. I mean, they're doing quite a bit, but the scale of what needs to be done and what is actually happening are not commensurate.
And I think that would be especially true in the next few months with the United States presidential election coming up, with the possibility of foreign interference and all kinds of things that we know happened in 2016 and could very well happen again. Another question we have here from Thomas: in a diverse community, Where no particular current issue has been brought up as divisive, is there a program or strategy you have used to encourage unity in that diverse community?
Can you read the first part of the question again? What is the
Well, it
policy?
says that in a diverse community where there is no current issue that's divisive, is there a program or strategy that can be used to help bring about unity amongst the diverse members of that community?
You know, this statement of there's two things. One is in most societies where I work in, there's already division and there are already issues that are going on. So it's very rare that I'm in a place where they are not trying to solve a problem, right? But what I do see is that an approach that talks about equality, talks about oneness, and a more proactive approach to learning unity in diversity, not wait for that crisis. So it's almost preventative. Is certainly possible. I must admit that most places where I work in, just by nature of my work, if they are not already struggling with this issue, I would not be engaged there. And everybody that I've shared here so far, I've had for not recently, but for generations. What I do see is, countries where there has been a certain level of, so the things simmer underneath, they are not sort of, open because these issues have not been challenged. Countries that have been very homogenous for a long period of time now suddenly have waves of immigrants coming in, and they are faced with this, or, communities that were united against a common enemy, that enemy is gone, now they're facing each other. So I feel like, this is accelerating. This tribalism is really accelerating. But I also see that, the back, this push towards unity, and there's also gaining momentum, and there are really good examples around the world of people trying to push back and build unity.
Yeah, interesting. Margaret asks this interesting question. What daily tools can be used to address hate speech? I think she means for individuals.
I think for individuals, in terms of daily tools, is certainly this faculty of justice that Baha'u'llah talks about. Is something that is something. It's to be cultivated. It doesn't stop. It's not a point that you reach. It's a point that we cultivate. And similarly, empathy and kindness go far beyond holding hands and singing songs. These actually are all these are all spiritual qualities that we have to build. And in a sense, a lot of the activities of the Baha'i community around the world is this is what the communities are doing, is building spiritual capacities and skills for service. So I think these are daily acts that we have to engage in. There's also the side of really learning, being open to knowledge, and particularly, I think there's the fear of someone who is prejudiced, who has to be opening themselves up to new ideas. But there's also a fear of people who feel like they are not prejudiced, and very often people who say, I am not racist, and now that idea is being challenged quite a bit about, it's not enough to be not racist. If you're living in a society, you have to be anti-racist. I think Angela Davis said that first, and now Ibram Kendi and others are writing about this. So what does that mean? It means sort of, looking at ourselves with honesty, with humility, but also a sense of hope that we are capable of change. And our society is capable of change, and never lose sight of that. But I think to engage in this daily practice, and as we open ourselves up for action, for new ideas to come in, I think then we expand both our capacity, but also societal capacity.
The Roshan, Zamir, and Graham family asks this question: can you tell us a personal example of an encounter you had with hate speech?
I can think of a lot of examples of hate speech, and In fact, one of the first encounters when I moved to the US, I went to graduate school in Florida, and within the second day, I was walking past one area, an older person who was sitting outside on their porch, and I said hello to them, and they started yelling at me, saying, "Go back to where you came from," and said their dog to come out and start barking at me. This was very, very early, and I remember that incident literally led in that day in the class that I was taking. Someone mentioned the Baha'i faith, and that is the first time I heard about the Baha'i faith here in the US. So I remember viscerally just being very afraid of that huge dog. He did not cross the fence, and I was fine, but it jolted me in a way and made me open to investigating what the Baha'i faith was all about. So there's a lot of, and then living in Sri Lanka, growing up during the Civil War, being part of a minority community, we saw microaggressions every day, but we also saw what large-scale violence and hate looked like, and it really destroys the potential of a society to progress and develop. And it is very, very saddening at so many levels. There's the individual, loss and pain and suffering. Then there's those communities that are forever scarred. And then you have whole nations that then don't develop and deal with poverty and corruption and the cycle that repeats itself. So a lot of encounters. But what I want to focus on is that for every encounter of hate that I've had, I've seen so many more encounters of people, who are just doing the right thing, and in their individual capacity as civil society, as leaders of communities and organizations, really, engaging in counter speech, engaging in speech that promotes the oneness. So that's really what I want to focus on. But thanks for that question.
Yeah, I remember. I think you had told me you were Tamil, and I think you had told me you were Sri Lankan. I had never put it together, and I now apologize. I had never put it together. What a very difficult situation the Tamils have been in for years, and presumably still are now that the Civil War is over. Carol.
Did you lose him, Vasu?
I lost you for a few minutes, but I can hear you now.
I don't hear Rob.
We lost Rob. Oh, I thought you all lost me.
No, you're good. Let's wait for him. He might. Do you want to make some more comments?
There's a comment from Zareen Caldwell saying, with some training in journalism, I believe very strongly in telling all sides of a story, that the Baha'i writings emphasize this too. But too much of the narratives out there are just telling one side. Does the training work you do address this as part of elevating the dialogue? Yes, I think telling all sides of the story is extremely important, and it's an integral part of independent investigation of truth, providing the tools. Also to do it in a way that doesn't re-victimize the victim and doesn't create false equivalencies. And I think this is, so in being able to say all sides of the stories, one also has to be, careful that the different sides are not seen as being equal. So I think, so this is the challenge. How do you, talk about, and also in this is also another unique challenge, which is non-partisanship, which is something that the Baha'i community, clearly stresses. It's an important principle of the Baha'i faith. But in a lot of countries, civil society organizations by law are required to be non-partisan. And when one particular, group or a party engages in, hate speech, and when they come out and talk about them or call them, hold them accountable, then they are often, accused of being partisan. And this is a real challenge. So what we often say is that, either election commissions or journalists in media institutions or civil society have to establish their independence, their neutrality, and impeccable professionalism way ahead before they start calling out, hate speech. And it's really important because you have to build that neutrality, and reputation, and then anchor your comments in a very thoughtful way. And as your, as you raised this question on, journalist training, these will obviously have to be done well, but first you have to establish that neutrality and independence.
Sorry, it does feel good to have 100 Mbps of internet connection when you have 0 internet connection. What can you do? That's the way the world is. I see you just answered Zareen's question. There is another question from Mariam. I don't know whether this was one of the ones you saw or not. How would you frame all sides of the story in a situation like Bosnia or others where one particular side is the clear aggressor?
So that I answered that question to not create false equivalencies. You do have to tell different stories, and you have to be very clear. And I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually provides us a globally accepted, to a large extent, framework to understand and talk about, is the dignity of communities or of individuals being violated? And if so, report it for what it is, call it for what it is. Don't just provide two sides there. You can certainly say why someone might be doing something, but you clearly, we have to have some common standards to talk about these things. So.
Very good. I'm trying to see if there are other questions. Camilla says, I don't have a lot of empathy, compassion, understanding for those who belong to hate groups, such as the Klan, white supremacists, groups who spout misinformation, and so on. Do you have any comments about this?
No, this is a, there's a legal response, there's a moral response, and there's sort of the the spiritual response to this, right? For individuals who are committing hate and committing violence, I think one can see where why they may be doing that. They should still be held to the same legal standards. They should be held to hopefully the legal standards do not condone those kinds of acts, but they should let the law take its course and actually advocate for it, raise awareness. So but we can still do all of that without hate. In a certain sense, while it's extremely difficult, and I totally agree with this question, I also think, but to look at this as a human soul that is so far away from its potential, so far away from what, God, in whatever way we want to think about God, so far away from their potential. And in that sense, there could be compassion for that soul, but not necessarily for those actions, by no means condoning those actions. But it's a tough question. I think you're asking a more introspective question than me providing an answer, but it is something we struggle with. But what I do talk in counter-speech training, what I often talk about, and when we practice these types of counter-speech, I always talk about, don't respond with anger, don't respond with hate. And this is where you do not mirror, you have to counter and build peace without mirroring that injustice on that oppression. So we have to figure out a higher moral ground to act from. And this is where I think, from that earlier question, spiritual practice, allows us to not respond with hate, but with respond with principle. So we are thinking with love for humanity, with love for oneness. So even in countering hate, you're responding from a place of love and justice.
Mm-hmm. Carol's question that I was asking when I got cut off by my internet, how much of our need to hate and use hate speech is related to our individual insecurities, feeling that we are less and below others and needing to build ourselves up, and how much of it is related to feeling it is necessary to go along with what others are doing in order to fit in, or not being brave enough to stand up against it?
So I think it's a combination of this, right? So we're talking about individual, sort of at a personal level, prejudice and hate speech that comes from the individual. there's also a broader, this is where disinformation and hate speech, sort of intersect, where there's hate speech with the intention to create harm to individuals and large groups of people. And this is sort of a much higher level, and a different order of magnitude issue that we are dealing with. Malign actors, could be foreign, could be domestic, that are creating this type of hate, and very often manipulating this individual who, for whatever reasons, has insecurity or even sort of genuine hate for another group. It may come from wherever, but it's manipulated at a very high level. What we need is, religious leaders, political leaders, a society that is allowing people to transcend that insecurity, see it for what it is. But instead, what we are seeing are, structures that are manipulating it and encouraging it. And I think this is really the challenge that a lot of societies are facing.
Yeah, and frequently political leaders are not willing to speak up against people in their own party who are conducting hate speech. And if there was more of that on the part of members of all parties, that obviously would make it harder for people to so first of all, people would have more respect for former leaders. And former leaders, it seems to me, really potentially can have a big role if they are willing.
And I think this is a really important, sort of idea that, hate, when it is politicized, then also becomes a partisan issue.
Right.
I think there are things that society should be able to agree that are, that are just plain wrong. And I think this is really where, civic education in a very broad sense, and education around the rights of minorities, pluralism, these are all extremely important. And, people directly engaging with someone from different communities is so vital, to hearing personal stories of what we construct as the other, is really very important. And when you know people from those communities and that becomes the norm, and that becomes sort of the living environment, then it is much harder to be prejudiced and harbor hate in our heart, because it will be challenged on a daily basis. In fact, there was a very good study that exposed groups of individuals to different type of counter messaging. And, one of the more successful counter message strategies there was exposing someone to their own, hypocrisy. And sort of, because we live with this cognitive dissonance often. And when we are exposed to that, then we are more likely to try to, address those issues that are going on inside us. There's another question here. What are
a couple of them from Facebook? What specific practical responses do you offer when hate is directed at you?
So, first of all, be safe. Decide whether you want to engage in that space or not, because not all hate speech is something that one needs to engage with. So I would say, think about safety. There are organizations, there are people, there are structures, where they will come to support people who are, are facing hate speech. So, sort of really look at what are these entities and groups that exist that can actually provide that kind of support. Heart Mob, there are several others that do that type of work. So think about those organizations and entities, and really, engage only if you feel it is absolutely necessary. One of the strategies of counter speech, because when someone is engaging in counter speech, either at you or at someone, they often have formed, they've made a public commitment to their position or their idea, and they're highly unlikely to change their mind. Yeah. What does work when we engage in counter speech in those kinds of scenarios is to talk to a broader, audience. A lot of people are doing good research on this. Dr. Babak Bahadur from George Washington University has done some good work, and we've had an opportunity to collaborate. There's a lot of research that's emerging here, but speak to a broad audience. If there is someone who is in that space who's not decided, or there you'll be able to influence them much better than the person engaging in hate speech. but also there may be other counter speakers who will be able to join. So change the norm of that space is one of the strategies that we talk about. But first and foremost, if you are, you're being attacked by somebody in an online space, be very, very careful whether you want to engage, and think through about personal safety.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Shahram asks this question: I assume most of the work you conduct in election systems is outside the US. However, it seems our own political and electoral systems are quite broken here in the US as well. So I have multiple questions relating to this. One, what would you say we do well, and where are we failing in the US? Two, are there interventions and strategies that you use overseas that you feel would also apply here to address the challenges in the US? And three, what are the government agencies or organizations in the US that do this work domestically and that you feel are effective?
This is a tricky question. No, so I do not work in the context through my work in the US, but have had the opportunity to look at what is happening, around the country. So what do we do well? I used to say that, now I had to sort of say everything with a caveat, that there was a tremendous amount of trust. I remember when I moved to the US, this was before I was a US citizen, so I never voted at that time, but, watching elections at a very local, level in churches and schools, and, there were bake sales going on during these elections. These local, people are running elections. I've known friends who have been poll workers, there was a sense of trust, a very local level. There was a sense of trust, even though most countries have a central election authority that runs elections. The US system was actually, one of its strengths was the decentralization, perhaps, where from the top to really corrupt the system was very difficult because it was very transparent, it's very community owned. There are challenges now, to that. I would say, gerrymandering is a huge challenge in US elections, where politicians pick voters as opposed to voters picking, politicians. So non-partisan, some states have passed non-partisan delimitation bodies, and that's, really, a good step. So if you ask me what is a good step, that is a really good step. In many countries I work in, we would talk about, sort of voter identification documents, whereas in the US, requiring, because there have been historic, definitely racism and historic barriers for people to access these documents and, this right to vote. So putting obstacles before people are able to vote is definitely not a good practice. So I can go through, a lot of these examples, but I really do think that, one of the key principles would be to have non-partisan running of elections, people who run elections. So we have in some states people who are both candidates, but also overseeing, their own elections. So I think these are the kinds of things that from an international perspective, we would look at it and say, this is definitely not good. But then in the US, for various historical reasons, these things are playing out. And I think they're being challenged by civil society. There are organizations that are doing, good work. So I'll leave it at that. It is a conversation for a whole nother. And then, of course, in that context is the Baha'i elections, which have very different, framework without, nominations or campaigning or candidates. This ability of communities to come together and elect their representatives. So so this is also something that I always think about when engaging with this work. There's a good question here. It's what stories do you draw inspiration from? So
yes.
Ask that question, but whoever's asked that, this is really what keeps me going. There are so many good stories. I'll say something recently. I've been working with a fairly large group of civil society organizations in India that have been addressing this crisis of migrants. So people have moved hundreds of, thousands of miles away from their homes to look for work, and the government brings sort of a work from home and sort of the shutdown, lockdown. And these people, they don't have work and they don't have any money and they're daily laborers. They just earn, for that. There's not any savings or any sort of economic buffer. And all transportation is ending and they are walking, thousands of, this is huge tragedy. Building. And what in that space, I saw so many young people, creating voluntarily, creating large groups of people, operations and feeding hundreds of thousands of people of different, communities. And in some, there was some anti-Muslim sentiment that came up in India, sort of building on some pre-existing prejudice, but based on a particular incident. There was a lot of anti-Muslim violence. And one of the stories that, I saw and people were sharing were, Muslims, this is sort of, some of you may know this Indian dish called biryani. This is very famous in South Asia. It's rice cooked with meat. And there were these, Muslim biryani makers who were cooking food and feeding these migrants who may have been from communities that would have potentially attacked them. And this story just was repeated. And there are so many such stories. People with disabilities who are facing immense issues due to lockdowns, then being protagonists and actually providing social services to others who are shut in. So, we tend to see people as victims very often, but truly they are, the human spirit is great. And telling those stories is both a great counter-speech strategy, but also very inspirational when you hear those stories. And so many. I saw a young person with a disability from Bangladesh start this campaign where he says, I'm Muslim, I'm male, I'm a person with disability, I'm Bangladeshi, and this is my identity. And then this became, many people are now developing similar videos and posting them online, building on that identity. Sort of, how do you create this broader identity? There are so many more good examples.
That's marvelous. A couple of questions in the question and answer forum. Thomas says he has some concerns about a particular country and organization and wants to have your email address. And so I'll just tell him that he can email the Wilmot Institute and we'll forward his question to you. Penny says this: in the UK, we are pulling down statues. Yeah, we're doing that here too in the US, and trying to erase our history. How do we make our history safe and tell the truth about it so we learn from it rather than destroy it? And that's a very good question.
It's a really good question. So I think there's two things. I think, just because, and this is just my personal view. So statues, why do we put up statues, right? We put up statues to glorify or to honor. Very rarely do we put up statues to just remind us that somebody was really, really bad. Someone did something really. We don't put up statues. So statues are often put up for, and particularly statues of people on horses in the middle of circles, which you have so many of in Washington, very tall statues. You elevate that person that you're building a statue for, right? So if you find out that that person has had a past or association that is not conducive to the oneness of humanity, that is not conducive to justice, that is not conducive to a sense of people feeling safe and welcome and open, removing that statue is not going to take away history, in my opinion. It actually is going to say, there is a more power. This is really, replacing a thought of hatred with a more powerful thought of love. So very often I would say, instead of just taking that statue down, take it and replace it with something that provides that welcoming message, that provides that message of justice, that provides that message of, and someone gave me a very, funny example is that, Satan plays a very large role in the life of Jesus and also in the Bible. We don't have statues of Satan everywhere, but he's not gone from history. He's very present. And I remember for years and years in Catholic school, learning about Satan and Jesus telling him to go away. I even remember those words in Tamil. I'll never forget, learning about Satan. So Satan's very present, but I don't necessarily need a statue for him. And if there's a statue somewhere and it's taken down, we won't erase them from history, right? So this is my approach. I'm sure others will have, different views, but, I feel like if we go back and question why a statue was put up in the first place, that will give us a sense of should it be, taken away or not. But we also have to understand that a lot of our leaders, have complex histories. We have founding fathers who had slaves.
Right.
Have a controversy that's brewing in many parts of Africa was Gandhi and Gandhi's views, on race, and particularly on Black Africans, that today we would say this is not okay. Now, people do evolve over their life and careers, and there is this connection between the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King and how he was inspired by Gandhi. Clearly, there was Gandhi had evolved, right? Or I don't know, but he did not espouse and continue to promote those views that he had in his 20s. So I think to understand that people are complex, and we can look at specific actions and principles that they promoted that were good, while still holding accountable things that we disagree with them, right? So I think this is an important. It's a good thing that we're having these complex conversations. This is not a bad this black and sort of this black and white version of history. There's a lot of gray space, and I think it's a really important conversations for societies to have, and hopefully, without disinformation and hate, we'll be able to have these conversations in a more open, environment based on principles.
Mm-hmm. There was a professor on National Public Radio, I believe, today, who made the distinction between someone whose statue is put up because they were in favor of retaining slavery and rebelling against the government of the United States, versus someone like, say, George Washington, for whom slavery was not an important issue in his life or an important reason why he was honored. He was honored for helping the country acquire independence and freedom and leading it towards its, being its first president. And so he's being honored for a different reason. And so the slavery thing is something that needs to be understood in that context and mentioned, certainly, but not, you don't necessarily take down the statue because of that, because you can't expect him to have understood our current sets of standards. So that was a good comment.
I think the more important question is, given where we are, what are we doing about it, right? I mean, the historic legacy in, certainly in my case, growing up in Sri Lanka, but many countries that I've worked, and certainly here in the United States, there have been historic marginalization of communities. And one of the things that COVID has shown us is, how these, how this discrimination and years of oppression makes people, that much more vulnerable. What are we going to do with this opportunity? It's really this question. In April, the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community commemorated the visit of Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, to Washington, and he spoke at Howard University, not very far from where I am now. And this year, our speaker was Dr. Ruha Benjamin, and she spoke about the pandemic as a portal, and really talking about race and her own scholarship and expertise in race and technology, and how if we are not thoughtful, these systemic ways of discrimination are going to get written into the future as well through evolving technology. So, and she really talked about this pandemic as a portal. And another, author from India, Arundhati Roy, she talks about this as well, the pandemic as a portal. Will we go through this portal taking with us all of the problems that we have had in the past, or will we walk through it with light, with less baggage, and try to use this as an opportunity? But it certainly seems like, Mother Earth is, giving us this, opportunity to really question, these patterns that we have, patterns of life that we have built that are based on, discrimination, that are based on unsustainable, ways of life and injustice. And what are we going to do moving forward? And how do we create a society where each individual is able to reach their highest potential?
Yeah. We have one other interesting question here. Right. So far, it's the last one. We'll see if we get any more. Can you share more about how you are working with children and youth in addressing hate speech? If there is time, could you share some examples of what children and youth are creating to reframe this and creating new forms of speech that points to the future new world.
One good example of this would be Baha'i children's classes, right? And this is really what children are and junior youth are learning all over the world is, new concepts, new questions to ask, to reframe, their understanding of the world. So that's clearly one example, which I'm sure, a lot of people who are viewing are intimately familiar with. So what I see outside of the Baha'i community through my work is very good civic education programs and civic education programs that are at the school level and university level. And I've seen really good ones in Georgia, in Ukraine, that are emerging, where students are discussing, learning about principles of equality, about democracy, about free speech, but also learning about it in the context of disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, sort of information integrity, but also really looking at pluralism, having conversations about pluralism. So I am seeing some very good examples, and I've been engaged in some very good examples, and I feel like they are all in various stages of development, because I think societies went through civic education. It was clearly, even in the US, there's been civic education, civic engagement, but somehow they haven't evolved to meet the new challenges, and haven't honestly addressed old challenges. And I think this is a really important question. So some people in majority sort of majority minority situations, people from a majority community will learn that this is their country and this is where minorities live. Whereas minorities might learn that this is a multi-religious, multilingual, multi-ethnic society where a lot of people live. So the fundamental worldview is very different, and particularly if they speak different languages, then these communities are taught very different things. And then when these children grow up, they have very different views of their own country. Their national identity is very different. So I think, I think that kind of bringing different groups together to a common vision of shared nationhood, we're beginning to see in a lot of countries. And I think, there are lots of good programs that I have seen that are teaching media literacy and critical thinking skills. My personal preference is that these things all be part of one unified, civic engagement, civic education, course, because you have to do this on a school level, and you have to do it at scale. You need to have governments involved. It cannot be a project that someone does on a small scale. You can certainly do pilots, but the more successful models will be, long-term engagement of looking at it integrated into the education system, and have everyone have access to that education system.
Yeah, exactly. That pretty much wraps up our questions. We had a very good set of questions tonight, too. I think it was a very good discussion. And I want to thank you very much for coming on, offering this fascinating presentation about how to respond to hate speech with, as you said, thoughts of hate have to be opposed by stronger thoughts of love. And then there are the ways we do it. So thank you very much, Vasu, for this fascinating presentation. We don't at the moment have other programs in the Global Challenges and Opportunities series planned, and we may sort of do a little bit of a summer vacation and resume them in the fall. We also are going to be planning some web talks in July and August, so we'll be able to announce those, and everyone should keep their eyes out for those as they come along. So I want to thank everyone tonight for participating in this fascinating presentation. Vasu, once again, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for coming, and we look forward to seeing you further in some other webinars in the future. Good night.
Good night.
In our lives there's a time a-coming when all the world seems lost and torn. In our lives there's a time a-coming